Hello everyone, this is Logan59XP here, and today I'm here to answer the question to the best of my ability of, was the Series X a mistake, or was it a good idea? The Series S, I think it's safe to say, is definitely the most controversial console of the generation. From the beginning, way back in the summer of 2020 when it was first rumored, people already had very strong feelings on it. The idea of having a lower power, cheaper console that launches alongside the true next generation flagship is something we've never really seen before, right? We've never had that, at least in modern console history, to my knowledge. That's never happened before. Sure, we've had multiple SKUs of consoles before, although never in hardware terms, like, the Wii U, for example. I know it's probably not the best example, but it's the only one I can think of right now. So, for example, the Wii U, right? In the US, at least, I can't speak for the rest of the world, but at least in the US, there was the 8 gig white model that nobody bought because it was clearly not worth it. And then there was the more expensive, I believe by about $50. It was $50 more. Black version that became the Wii U for most people, myself included, that had 32 gigs and came with Nintendo Land, right? Stuff like that has been around for ages. There's always been SKUs, there's been bundles, stuff like that for consoles at launch. But we've never had two straight up different pieces of hardware at the beginning of a generation that are supposed to function as one generation of consoles, right? Because again, we've had mid-gen refreshes, we've had slims, we've had obviously the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X last generation, we've had the new 3DS, but we've never had this specific arrangement before. And the reason why it was so controversial, the reason why at the time people were very resistant to it, was because of this perceived idea of, if the Series S is going to be this lower power, cheaper console, that means that now, simply by the fact that it exists and it's going to be around at launch, it will now be the minimum for console development going forward, right? The bare minimum is not going to be, the PS5 or the Series X, depending on which one you thought was better. Obviously, that conversation's been had. The whole, 10.2 teraflops versus 12 teraflops. The Digital Foundry comparisons of this game is higher resolution or has a better frame rate on this console or on that console. That's been talked about plenty. And honestly, at this point, they're about the same. I mean, they're pretty much the same. As someone that owns both the PS5 and the Series X, the games, when I play the same game on both platforms, they look and run pretty much the same. Sometimes it's a little better on PS5, sometimes it's a little better on Series X, depending on the game, but it's pretty similar. Like, it's not at all like it was with the PS4 and base Xbox One, where we had, at launch, there was the whole, Battlefield 4 is 900p on PS4 and 720p on Xbox One, or Call of Duty Ghosts was 1080p on PS4 and 720p on Xbox One. No, it's not like that at all. Not really, especially in this age of dynamic resolutions and stuff, It looks about the same from what I can tell. With my eyeballs on a 4K screen, it looks pretty much the same in most games that I've compared. Of course, I'm not claiming that that's perfect scientific testing or anything. Obviously, if you want, to know the real specifics of that, obviously, Digital Foundry is the place to go. And Digital Foundry is great. But I think they have also shown that for the most part, it's not that different. Now, obviously, we have the PS5 Pro, and that's a whole other conversation. But for the base consoles, the ones that most people have, PS5, Series X, the hardware is as similar as it's ever been, essentially. But the Series S isn't. The Series S is clearly its own little beast, its own little thing that is not at all the same as the others, but also very similar in some ways. So let's kind of go ahead and do a little refresh of the specs, for those of you that don't know or don't remember the specs of the Series S. Well, as far as the core specs, the ones everyone actually cares about, so the CPU is the same, pretty much, between the Series X and Series S. The Series X is an 8-core Zen 2, just like the PS5 is. I forget the actual, I believe it's 3.6 gigahertz for the Series X, but then the Series S is 3.4 gigahertz, I believe. Those numbers may not be exactly right, but they're pretty much the same. But I do know that the clock speed is definitely lower on the Series S, but only by a little bit. Again, it's like 3.6 to 3.4, something along those lines. So the CPU is identical otherwise. It's Zen 2, it's 8 cores, 16 threads, all that stuff. It's the same CPU as the Series X, which is good because obviously for games that are CPU demanding, that means that you're not going to be sacrificing anything on the Series S version. However, the graphics and especially the RAM is where the real controversy starts. Now, I'm not going to lie, I don't remember how many CUs. I believe that's the word, CUs. Is CUs what it is for NVIDIA, or is CUs what it is for AMD, or is it for both? I don't know. I'll admit that that's one aspect of hardware specifications that I've never fully grasped, is the whole, the GTX. I'm just gonna make up a random number, so this is not at all accurate. Just to be clear, the GTX 1070 has 1028 compute units, and the 1080 has 1060 compute units or whatever. Therefore, the 1080 is better because it has more compute units. Stuff like that. I've never fully grasped that, other than obviously, I still don't really understand how compute units work. I'll admit that. It's something I'm not well versed in at all. All I really know is, generally speaking, more compute units, better. So, shocker, there's more compute units on the Series X compared to the Series S. And I don't remember the actual number, but I know that the Series S is substantially less compute units. And it shows, because, the way Microsoft marketed the console was it was supposed to be the 1440p equivalent to the Series X's 4K. And you know what? If the console had actually maintained that would have actually been a really solid device, Yeah, it's got its other limitations, and we'll get to that in a second. But honestly, if that initial kind of marketing thing that they had of the Series X is native 4K, Series S is native 1440p, if they actually had maintained that, if that's actually what had happened, and obviously that was never going to be up to Microsoft to decide, because obviously third party is going to do whatever they want. But obviously, in the end, while there are games out there that run at 1440p, they absolutely do exist. I think the majority of games, last I checked, and I used to watch this Google, I probably still have it in my bookmarks, but I actually know there is a Google Sheets out there that lists every Series S game and what resolution frame rate they run at, the dynamic res, target frame rate. They'll also include 360 backwards compatibility for games that were Xbox One X enhanced that you play on the Series S, so then those would run at 1440p a lot of the time instead of 4K, but they'd be 4K on the Series X, obviously. But my point is, last I checked, and it admittedly has been a while, probably a few years at this point, but I know at least as of 2022, 2023, most games on Series S were 1080p max. And for what it's worth, most people are okay with that. Most people are especially if you hook it up to a 1080p screen, you put it on an old 1080p screen in the bedroom or whatever, that's fine, right? 1080p image, 1080p TV, no harm, no foul. The problem is that later on, and this is something that's affected the PS5 and Series X as well, but it's most obvious on the Series S, of course, is once FSR 2 came into the picture and games and big third-party games started to use FSR 2, that's when the resolutions became a problem on all the consoles, but the Series S especially. I can't think of any specific examples of a game I can point to and be like, wow, that's a low resolution. Unlike, for example, probably a famous case on the Switch 1, that is Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Not 3, I don't remember what 3's resolution was, but for Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in 2017, in handheld mode, the resolution could dip as low as 360p. Which, yeah, that's pretty brutal. And even in docked mode, it's definitely a soft game. I think it maxes out at around 720p, which is one of the reasons why I really hope that all the Xenoblade games, 1, 2, 3, X, I hope they all get patches or upgrades for Switch 2, because, man, those games look really good underneath that resolution, but they just need a res bump. Just give them a res bump, man, and the games would look so much better. But that's neither here nor there, and that's a whole other conversation. But point is, the Series S, I know, at least I've heard people talk about, again, I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head, but maybe, was it Jedi Survivor? I know Jedi Survivor was kind of infamous for image quality on all the consoles, but the Series S, I think especially. Was that the one that was 720p DRS with FSR2? I don't know. I know there's been a couple of games that have had some low resolutions on Series S. and not in just a performance mode, because obviously if there's a quality in a performance mode, the performance mode is generally going to be lower than 1080p most of the time on Series S, with the quality mode being, 1080p 30 or 1440p 30, whatever. But for games where it's only 60 FPS, they tend to be 1080p best case scenario, at least for like modern games. I mean, obviously, again, I know like Halo Master Chief Collection on Series S is 1080p 120. I'm honestly surprised it's not 1440p 120 when the Series X version is 4K 120 and they're like 360 games and stuff. So I'm not really sure why they don't do 1440p 120, or at least why there's not a 1440p 60 mode. To my knowledge, they never added that. So if you play Halo MCC, any of the games, Halo 1, 2, 3, 4, Reach, ODST, all of them run at the same resolution. I believe if you play those games on Series S to this day, it will be 1080p 120, and that's it. There's no 1440p 60 option if you're playing on a 1440p monitor and you want to have the higher resolution, which I am 100% convinced that the console can do. There's no way that because the Series S can run other 360 games at 1440p 60 just fine. So that's probably just I guess they just figured that, hey, 1080p is good enough and people would value the 120 hertz. And to be fair, that's probably more important in a game like Halo. But that's beside the point. I guess my main point with this whole tangent, we haven't even talked about the RAM yet. We'll get to that in a second. But my main point is the graphics are substantially weaker. Now, they have all the same features. Now, it's RDNA 2, just like the Series X, and it has, ray tracing and all. It has all the features that the Series X has. It's just way slower. So that's been that was definitely a contentious thing right there, and we have seen those limitations bore out in a lot of games. Not all of them. There definitely are good Series S versions out there. I mean, back when I had a Series S in 2022, there definitely were games out there that were actually looked pretty solid on the Series S. And for what it's worth, I kind of ditched my Series S before I got the Series X, which is what, of course, I wanted the whole time. But I figured, hey, I'll mess with the Series S in the meantime just to see what it's like. And I think that, and I got rid of my Series S before, the FSR2 low-res stuff kind of came in. So I maybe arguably saw the best of what the Series S had to offer from a resolution perspective. But again, that's kind of a whole other thing. But we've been talking about this part of the system for too long here. Point is, the graphics are substantially slower, although they have all the same features. Okay, now let's get to what is probably, in my opinion, the biggest problem with the Series S. The one problem I've had with it since the beginning. The RAM. Now, the Series X and Series S have, shared RAM, where it's I think on the Series X, it's so Series X and PS5 have 16 gigs. Now, the PS5, as well as the PS4 before it, had unified RAM. So it was all, 8 gigs, 16 gigs, it was all the same speed, all that stuff. But on the Series X and Series S, it's split, and some of the RAM is faster than the others. Now, I believe on the Series X, it's been a while. I want to say it's 10:6. I forget the exact split of what the exact split is and which one's faster than the other. But the point is, there's split RAM, and I know and I believe on the Series S, and I do know this. I believe on the Series S, it's 8 gigs, 2 gigs. So it's not 10 gigs unified. It's 8 gigs, 2 gigs, which doesn't help. But that's also a thing with the Series X as well. And people have debated about how much does that matter for Series X performance. That's not really a topic for right now, and that's not really all that interesting to talk about. For me anyway, so we're not gonna really get into that, but point is, it has split RAM, and the Series S has 10 gigs, and 10 gigs, again, in 2020, when we found out it was gonna be 10 gigs, I was like, it's only 2 more gigs than the Xbox One. I mean, yeah, the RAM is a lot faster than the base Xbox One, which used DDR3, where the PS4 used GDDR5, but only 2 more gigs on a console that's supposed to last, 8 years, maybe longer, with cross-gen. That's going to hurt it. Which is one of the reasons why, when the Switch 2 was being rumored, I was really hoping they'd do 12. Because people were talking about 8. It's going to have 8 gigs, and I'm like, no. 8 gigs is going to be a bad idea, because yes, that's more than the current Switch. It's double. The current Switch has 4 gigs of RAM. If the Switch 2 had 8 gigs, that would still be twice as much RAM, but 8 gigs of RAM in 2024, 2025, it might be okay at first, but it would hurt them down the line. And I'm glad they went with 12. I mean, 16 would have been ideal. In an ideal world, the Switch 2 would have had 16 gigs, so it could be on par with the PS5 and Series X. But it has 12, which is more than the Series S. And we'll get to the Switch 2 Series S kind of comparison in a bit, because that's actually one of the key factors that arguably makes the Series S a good thing that actually happened. But we'll get to that when we get to it. Hello everyone, this is Logan59XP here for a quick update from the future. So I realized I completely forgot to talk about the Switch 2 Series S kind of comparison and why the Series S existing might actually be a boon for Switch 2 third-party support. Now I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because this video is already long enough as is, but the long and short of it is essentially the Series S existing could arguably be a pro for the Switch 2 if you care about third-party games on Switch 2, which I personally don't. A Nintendo console to me is a Nintendo console. It exists for first-party games and not much else. But if you're someone that buys third-party games on the Switch 2, then games like, say, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Final Fantasy 16, GTA 6, of course, is the big one, although I don't think GTA 6 is going to happen, to be clear. But people have talked about, could games like that, games that are designed for the PS5, for the Series X, that have no last-gen versions, could they theoretically come to the Switch 2, because the Switch 2 is going to be, at least in theory, within spitting distance of the Series S, at least in some respects. And it will be better in some aspects, like the RAM, because, like I've mentioned already, the Series S has 10 gigs of RAM, but the Switch 2 is going to have 12 gigs of RAM. So, and because developers have to make their games run on the Series S if you want to put them on Xbox, that might actually bode well in some respects for Switch 2 versions. Now, of course, just because a game runs on the Series S doesn't necessarily mean it can run on the Switch 2, because the Series S is still legitimately better than the Switch 2 in some aspects, most notably the CPU. The CPU is still a lot better on the Series S because it's a Zen 2 8-core versus I don't even know how many cores the Switch 2 CPUs has, but I know it's slower, at least overall, than the Series S's, however. Graphics might be a bit more comparable, but again, I'm not entirely sure about that. But it definitely has more RAM, and it has enough modern features like DLSS, ray tracing, tensor cores, all that stuff, that if a developer tried hard enough, and we've seen some miracles be pulled off on the Switch 1 already from Panic Button and stuff, so if a developer really wanted to get their game running on the Switch 2, and if it has a Series S version that runs at least okay, then it theoretically could be possible, at least in some games. Again, I know people keep talking about GTA 6. Is there going to be a Switch 2 version of GTA 6? I'm going to say probably not, especially if GTA 6 is very CPU demanding, and I imagine it will be, because it's GTA 6. So the CPU on the Switch 2 might not be good enough, but graphics and RAM-wise, it should be close enough or better than the Series S by enough that should help third-party support throughout the rest of at least this generation, which ironically is only a few years left because it's 2025. Next generation is supposed to be 2027, 2028, but of course there's going to be cross-gen. So again, this may matter for third-party support. That's really all I wanted to say. Again, I could talk a little more about this, but this video is long enough as is. I just wanted to get that out of the way. Depending on how you look at it, the Series S existing in the first place might be considered a win simply because of it helping with Switch 2 third-party support. So enough with that, let's get back to the rest of the video. But yeah, the 10 gigs of RAM. Forget that it's split. Forget that it's split for a second. It could be unified 10 gigs and it would make no difference. Having 10 gigs of RAM on a next-generation console that's supposed to get all the same games as its 16 gig bigger brothers was always going to be a problem. And it was a problem, and it did not take long for it to be a problem. It wasn't a problem at first all that much, because of course we were very much in that cross-generation era. We still kind of are to an extent, although most games are now only launching on the current-gen consoles. But there definitely are still games launching on PS4 and Xbox One, especially smaller titles. Call of Duty's still launching on last-generation consoles, Madden, and it's not FIFA anymore, it's EA FC, because they lost the license. All those games are still launching, and of course, Fortnite, Minecraft, Rocket League, all those games are still being updated and fully supported. GTA Online, That's all still being fully supported on last generation consoles. And of course, there was that thing from, I want to say, a year ago, where Sony was like, oh, about 40% of our PlayStation's network subscribers, PlayStation Plus subscribers are still on PS4. People took that and were like, oh, that means that the PS5 is not very successful because look how many people are still on the PS4, or whatever. That's how people, we're kind of parading that around. But I think that more so just has to do with the fact that, you can get, basically, because there's a stereotype, right, when it comes to, a certain kind of person that buys a console. And one of the stereotypes I've heard for a long time is the FIFA and COD player, the person that has a console, whether it's a PlayStation or an Xbox, and the only thing they play on it really is 1 or 2 games, with the stereotype being FIFA or Call of Duty, because those are, of course, big sellers that come out every year. Although, of course, again, FIFA is now called FC, but that's beside the point. And for people like those, and there are a lot of people in that group, it's obviously far from everyone, but there are a decent amount of people that do only have a PlayStation or an Xbox or a PC or whatever, and they only really play a handful of games. And as long as those handful of games keep coming out on the console they have, then they have no reason to upgrade. And I think that's more so the reason why people have hung on to the PS4, less so, the PS5 being more expensive and there not being as many exclusives as people would like. Again, that's a whole other thing, and it's been talked about to death. The whole, the state of exclusives on PlayStation and Xbox. So that's been talked about to death. I'm not really going to add to that, at least for now. But point is, I think that has more so to do with it than anything else. But getting back to the point I was originally making here about the RAM is essentially. But I guess my main point with the RAM is, it really is just as simple as, even as someone that's not a developer, is not a developer, never will be a developer, and does not claim to know anywhere near as much about this as a developer would, even from the outside looking in, the Series S having only 10 gigs was going to hurt it, because while cross-gen is still a thing, and games are developed for the PS4 and Xbox One in mind, that's not a problem. But the second we move away from those consoles, it will start being a problem. And the second we started to get, proper next-gen exclusives that were developed with the PS5 as really the base target, since of course it's the most popular consoles generation, that's when we started to see the Series S struggle. And we've seen even some cases like Baldur's Gate 3, where the Xbox version had to be delayed because the Series S couldn't run split screen. And Microsoft had a mandate where the Series S version must have all the same gameplay features as the Series X version. Now, not graphics features, now, because of course, plenty of Series S games don't include ray tracing, even though it's theoretically capable of it, because obviously it's not powerful enough to run it well, or whatever. But that's something I can't imagine will be any different with the Switch 2. The Switch 2 is ray tracing, and I don't actually know how much more powerful. The ray tracing in the Switch 2 is probably better than the Series S, simply by the nature of it being Ampere versus RDNA 2, even if it is a mobile chip. But I don't think anyone's really expecting the Series S to do crazy ray tracing at all, It will probably be on the same level as what the Series X and PS5 do, where, we got some ray trace lighting, we got some ray trace shadows here and there. We'll have lumen and nanite. That's about it. You're not going to get any crazy path tracing stuff, obviously. But again, that's a whole other conversation. But I'm getting sidetracked here. Point is, the RAM, it should have been 12 gigs, at the very least, if not 16. I know that would have made the console more expensive for Microsoft to make, but frankly, if the whole idea was having an entry point for Game Pass, then they should have taken a hit on that anyway, because they've already made it clear that they don't really care about console sales that much anymore. I mean, I'm sure they obviously still want them to sell, but the messaging from Microsoft for a long time now, even before this big multi-platform push, was, you buy our console to use it with Game Pass, and that's kind of it. That's kind of been like their whole thing is Game Pass, Game Pass, Game Pass. And Game Pass is cool. I have Game Pass. I've had it for a long time. But that's the reason you buy an Xbox. The Series X is just a Game Pass machine for me. That's its entire purpose for being. I have one as my Game Pass machine. I don't buy games on it. I haven't bought games on it in a long time. I get DLC occasionally, like, for Forza, Forza Horizon 4, Forza Horizon 5, I get the DLC for that, but I don't buy games on Xbox, because it's a Game Pass machine, and it's been like that for me for pretty much as long as Game Pass has existed. It's like, 2017, 2018. For as long as I've had Game Pass, it's just, my Xbox became a Game Pass machine, and an EA Play machine when that was a separate thing, but then eventually it got merged with Game Pass Ultimate, and now it's just included, but... Again, I'm getting off track here. So, we'll just leave it at the RAM is not enough. It's only 10 gigs, and that wasn't a big deal when PS4 was the baseline, but now that PS5 is the baseline and 16 gigs is the baseline, it's now become a much bigger problem, and we've seen, again, the split screen. Now, I don't know if that split screen issue with Baldur's Gate 3, if that was exactly because of the RAM, but I know we've heard other developers complain about the RAM, so that might just be the graphics, I'm not entirely sure. But the point is, the limitations of the console are being very much felt by developers that have to program for it, and that's one of the issues with the Series S, is that with Microsoft, like I was saying before, if you put out a game on Series X, you have to have a Series S version, vice versa. You can't just put out a Series X version of the game. You must support the Series S, and that's one of the reasons why back in 2020 people were concerned about it, because they knew, because Microsoft said back then that, like, games are developed for both and they have to be on both, which means that it can't just be a situation of, oh, this game doesn't run well on the Series S, no big deal, we just won't put it on there. No, you have to put it on the Series S. You have to. It is required by Microsoft. If you don't put it on the Series S, you're not putting it on the Series X. You get no Xbox version at all. And that was something that people had issues with back then, but obviously I guess the idea behind that would be that, hey, once you buy a Series S, you're now locked in. Developers can't just abandon you because the console isn't good enough anymore at a certain point. They have to support you for better or for worse. And in some respects, that's a good thing, because it means that your next generation console that you're buying in 2020 for $300 will always run next generation games for the rest of the generation, no matter how well or poorly they run. They will always be there because developers don't have a choice. So in that respect, it's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, because it's like, well, what if a developer could run a game on the Series X just fine? Because again, the Series X and the PS5 are pretty much the same thing for the most. I mean, they're not the same thing, obviously, but they're extremely similar. So if a game runs on the PS5, it will run on the Series X pretty much just as well. So if a developer wants to put their super demanding game that runs on PS5, okay, on the Series X, no problem. But if they want to, but then they have to make a Series S version. So if it doesn't run well on the Series S, then there's no Xbox version. At least that's how it's been so far. Now, Microsoft did eventually lift, at least partially, that limitation of gameplay parity, where I think they eventually did allow, oh god, what are they called? Larian Studios, that's their name. They eventually allowed Larian to put out the Series X version and the Series S version at the same time, but the Series S version didn't have split screen. So they kind of half pulled back on that. But of course, people saw that as, okay, is this going to be like, is this just, what the first domino to fall, and eventually, we'll get to the point where developers can just ignore the Series S and just put games on the Series X. But then there's the conundrum of, at least from what we've heard, now Microsoft has not put out official sales statistics for the Xbox consoles since like 2014. So all we have to go off of is, hearsay and from what other companies in the business say. So we don't know an official number, but supposedly the number for the Series X and S is around 25, 30-ish million right now. And the PS5 we know is about like 70 million. So this PS5 is more than double the Series X and S combined right now. But from what we've heard, the ratio of how many people in that 25, 30 million that have a Series X versus a Series S, the Series S is way higher. Like, I forget the exact number, but it was like 60, 70, maybe even 80, percent Series S to Series X, So even if Microsoft said, okay, you don't have to put out a Series S version, would it even be worth the time for them to put out a Series X version, because the Series X on its own hasn't sold enough for them to justify it? We've heard this from developers as well. So, yeah, I mean, the Series S really has kind of bungled things up in a way. So I've talked about the cons of the Series S. It's all the stuff everyone's heard before, but it's all totally true. The weaker graphics, 10 gigs of RAM. It's also an all-digital console. There's no disk drive. That's also another downside to it. Although personally, I gave up the ghost on physical media on Xbox a long time ago. The other consoles are different, but like on Nintendo and PlayStation, I still buy physical. But on Xbox, like I said, it's been a Game Pass machine for me for like 7 years, 8 years at this point. The last physical game I bought, like new, keyword new, when it was new, was like Black Ops 3. And that came out almost 10 years ago. Now, I did get a used copy of Forza Horizon 3 last year because I wanted to play Forza Horizon 3, and Forza Horizon 3, unfortunately, you can't buy it anymore because of licensing stuff. You can't buy the DLC anymore, which is really annoying. But if you want to just play the base game, which will fully update to the newest version that has the 1X enhancements, so that'll be nice. You can do that. You can go get a cheap copy. Like, I just got mine at like the local GameStop, which was in our local mall, which, unfortunately, because our local mall is a mall that is currently on its way out the door. No joke, it literally is on its way out the door. I've been there a couple of times in the last year or so, and it gets more and more empty every time I go there. In fact, the last time I went there, the GameStop I bought that game from in 2024 was gone. All gone. Signs gone. Empty. Totally gone. That's a shame, but I can't say I'm surprised. Although, fun fact, I have to bring this up real quick. I know it's not related to what we're talking about, but this is just too interesting of a fact to not bring up. So when I went in June of 2024 to get... I went to the mall just because I hadn't been to that mall in like forever, and I was like, hey, well, let me see how it's doing, because, malls in America and, modern day are not exactly known for doing very well. So I was curious, to see. So I asked the guy when I was there, hey, just out of curiosity, like, how's like the store doing, considering that you're in the middle of like a dying mall and all that? And he was like, well, actually, we do pretty all right here. And actually, I believe now I could be getting this number wrong, and of course I can't ask the guy again because the store is gone now. Even if I wanted to ask him again next time I went there, if it was still there, but he told me a very, very interesting fact, which is that particular GameStop was number 7 in like collectibles, Funko Pops, plushies, stuff like that, and like trading cards, stuff like that. It was number 7 in the whole country. Of the hundreds of GameStops that exist in the United States of America, it was number 7. I was actually very surprised at that. Like, really? That's neat. Hope you guys stick around. I literally said that to him. I literally said, I hope you guys stick around, and obviously that did not end up panning out, but that's a whole other conversation. So, anyways, getting back to the main point here. So yeah, I got Forza Horizon 3 on disc. I also got a cheap copy of GTA 5 on Series X, so my dad can play it, because he's been meaning to play that game for a while. And I have it on PS5 already because of the upgrade they did, because of like the cheap upgrade. And it was like was it a $10 upgrade or was it a $15 upgrade? I don't know. Back when GTA 5 on PS5 and Series X came out, if you had the PS4 or Xbox One version, you could get like a cheap upgrade for like $10 or whatever. So I got that. So I have that, but yeah, but since I wasn't using the Xbox at the time, I was like, hey, we can put the Xbox in the living room and you can use that, so we'll just get a cheap copy of GTA 5. Point is, outside of those two games, I have not bought a physical game on Xbox in a long time. So to me, the Series S being digital only isn't that big of a deal. Yes, I wish it had a disc drive. But again, the writing's been on the wall for at least Xbox when it comes to physical media. Now, again, the other consoles are different. Other consoles are a different story. Maybe we can talk about that another time. But for Xbox, the writing has been on the wall. Of the 3 big console makers, they are the one that has clearly, blatantly, and publicly been the most digital focused for quite some time. So, it not having the disc drive, yeah, it sucks, but it was going to be a Game Pass machine for me anyway, so it didn't really matter that much. Yeah, it would have been nice to be able to put in some of my old 360 games or early Xbox One games, but it wasn't the end of the world, especially since a lot of those games would be like older Call of Duties, and like my thinking was that, well, hey, once the Activision deal goes through, they'll all be on Game Pass anyway. Although it's been like Well, when did it get finalized? Like, was it October of last year? Or what? No, it was October of 2023. I believe that's when the deal was finalized. It's been like a year and a half since the Activision deal was finalized, and somehow not all of the Call of Duties are on Game Pass yet. Now, some of them are, Modern Warfare 3 is on there, Modern Warfare 2, the new Modern, when I say Modern Warfare 3 and Modern Warfare 2, the new ones, not the old ones. The new Modern Warfare 3 and 2 are on there, Black Ops 6 is on there, but none of the older ones are on there yet, and I don't know what the holdup is. Surely they'll be added at some point, because they've added the old Crash games and other old Activision and Blizzard games on there, but they haven't added the old Call of Duties yet. I don't know, I'm sure they'll get around to it at some point, but but I guess the main point here is, the Series S, it doesn't have the disc drive. It's got 10 gigs of RAM, the graphics are a lot slower, so you got the idea. I apologize that I'm probably repeating myself and taking way too long to get to the end of the conversation here, but okay. Those are the cons of the Series S. So let's talk about the pros, because there are things about the Series S I like. It's not a bad console. At least I don't think it's a bad console. Because, like I said a couple of times so far, I used to have a Series S. I had a Series S from March to August of 2022. So before that point, let me give you some history on my history with Xbox. So the very first Xbox I ever had was our cousin's old 360, because they got the new Slim 360 that was way better and didn't overheat and didn't red ring. They got that one, and we got their old OG Xbox 360 that does overheat and does red ring. Speaking from experience, there were many times between 2013 to 2015 when I used the console at its peak. It overheated a decent amount of time. I remember, calling Microsoft and, doing all the different techniques everyone said to do. And we took the console apart a couple of times and put it back together. And the original 360 is a classic design. But the overheating and red ring thing, I can assure you, it very much was a thing. There's a reason why it was memed so much. And I still have my OG 360s, both the one we got from our cousins and another one that we got later. And they still work, but it's like, why do I want to hook them up when I don't want to have to deal with the red ring, and also just the heat that comes out of them. There's a lot of heat that comes out of those OG 360s, which was great for my cat, because my cat back in the day used to really like sleeping behind the 360 when I was using it, because it would just blast so much hot air, and of course cats love hot air. But point is, we had an OG 360 from like 2009, 2010 onward. We got another 360 later. And like the golden age of the 360 for me, ironically, was actually the early Xbox One era from like 2013 to 2015. That's when I played the 360 all the time. There were like the three main games: GTA 5, Black Ops 2, Minecraft. That was like the holy trinity for the Xbox 360, and I played that console a ton. A lot of fun with a lot of friends at the time. That's definitely an era I look back fondly on, even if I don't think about it too much. Didn't quite when we transitioned to the Xbox One, that whole kind of dynamic didn't quite carry over as much, but that's beside the point. Point is, that's when I was using the 360 the most during that time. But the point is, I've had a 360 since 2010, 2011, whenever we got it from them. I don't even remember the exact date, but we didn't start actually using it until like 2012, 2013. Yeah, we played it every now and then. There were some old Lego games we had. There were some old Call of Duties we had, but we didn't like start using it like to play online with our friends and stuff. We didn't start doing that until like 2013. That's how late we were to the Xbox 360, but it didn't matter. We still had a great time on the Xbox 360. And we went through the whole rigmarole, the classic, and everyone memes it, but it is true. The whole, it's my turn on the Xbox. That we went through that many times back in the day, like unironically. That was, it's really funny. This is kind of, again, I'm getting off topic here, but what was I going to say? Oh yeah, so it's kind of funny because back in the day, right, my original online name was Nintendo Addict 8, right? But, which was the name I had during that 2013 to 2015 time frame. And yet, despite my online name being that, the console I played the most by far was the 360, not the Wii U. I mean, obviously I had a Wii U, and obviously I played it, But the 360 was like the main console. It was the main console by far, you know. The Wii U was the Nintendo machine, and the everything else machine was the Xbox. And that's never really changed, obviously. That's the case to this day, you know. Obviously, I have a Switch. I'm gonna get a Switch too. Have it pre-ordered, locked in at Walmart. But it's not my main system, and never will be. It will always be, probably a PlayStation at this point. You know, the PS5 is my main console, but yeah. So, again, I'm getting off track here. We're supposed to be talking about the pros of the Series S here. So, oh yeah, the history of the Xbox. Yeah, had a 360 from like 2010 onward, around that time. You know, whenever the new Slim came out, which I think was 2010, we got their old console, and then we started like really using it in 2013 to 2015 before we got an Xbox One. And then we got an Xbox One, or to be more specific, I got an Xbox One, the Fallout 4 1 terabyte bundle specifically, for Christmas in 2015. I was obviously pretty excited about that. I even got Black Ops. So I mentioned I got Black Ops 3 when it came out. That was from before we had the system. I bought that game, the Hardened Edition specifically, before I even knew I was going to get an Xbox One. I was that confident that I was going to get one. I bought a game before I even had the system. Before I knew I was going to get it. But anyway, so we got an Xbox One. And eventually I upgraded it to an Xbox One S, I think around 2017, 2018. Then eventually I got an Xbox One X in August of 2020, so pretty much right before the Series X and S came out. And then I used that as my Xbox until March 2022 when I got the Series S. So yes, I downgraded, so to speak, from an Xbox One X to an Xbox Series S. Not something a lot of people did, but I did it. Now, granted, it was always going to be temporary. Of course, I wanted a Series X. I was going to get a Series X, but I wanted to try the Series S first. I wanted to see what that was like. And so I did. And I do like the Series S. It has its flaws. We've already talked about some of them, but I do like the Series S. I like the form factor a lot. I really like how compact and portable it is. And that's something that did come on handy when I took it on some trips and stuff. It was nice that you could just fit it wherever you wanted and you didn't have to worry about it. It's just this nice, cute little box. And I mean, again, it wasn't a big standout. Again, it was nothing crazy. It was the most of the three current consoles. The PS5, Series X, and Series S. It was the most, quote, boring design-wise, I suppose, but it worked. It worked though, and it was a nice, compact little console. More reminiscent of like the size of a Wii U than it was a Series S. A Series X or a PS5, which obviously are way bigger than it. So yeah, I liked the form factor a lot. I thought the white color looked really good on it. I know they came out with a black one later. It just doesn't look right to me. The Series S will always be a white console, and if I ever got one again, and I'm not gonna lie, there's a part of me that still wants to get a Series S. Not to replace the Series X, but like just to have one again. There's a part of me that wants to get one for cheap on eBay, because you can get Series S's for like relatively cheap prices, like at least the console itself, not with a controller. You can get the console itself for like $200 on eBay or whatever last time I checked. And maybe I'll do that again one of these days, just to mess around with it again, because I think that'd be kind of neat. And also just to have a portable, current gen system, that'd be kind of neat to have. But that, again, that's a whole other thing. But yes, the form factor. I really liked the form factor. I really liked the white color on both the console itself and the controller. And I liked how portable it was. And the games that I played at the time looked fine on the Series S. Now again, like I mentioned before, most of them tended to be 1080p max, but you know what? But this console was supposed to be the companion to the PS5. That's how I always saw the Series S, especially the fact that they had that white color. It always felt, at least back in the day, it felt like what Microsoft was trying to do with the Series S was they were trying to make a companion to the PS5. It's like Microsoft themselves knew that everyone was going to buy a PS5 and they weren't going to buy a Series X, but they still wanted to be able to get people on Xbox, on Game Pass, playing their games. So how do you do that? You make a console that, when you put them side by side, they really do look like they're made for each other. Like, man, when I had the Series S, I put it right next to my PS5. It looked like they were just meant to be together. You know, it's like Microsoft designed a console specifically for people that have their competitor. It was kind of funny, but yeah. So I thought it complemented the PS5 really well. And the games I played on it ran fine. I mean, sure, backwards compatibility wasn't as great because the backwards compatibility used the Xbox One, the base Xbox One versions as their base, as opposed to the Xbox One X versions, which of course is what happens if you play an Xbox One game on Series X that had Xbox One X enhancements, then you get the Xbox One X version, which is notable in the cases of, again, Forza Horizon 3, which got an Xbox One X update in 2018 before Forza Horizon 4 came out that added native 4K. It's still 30 FPS, but it is native 4K, so that was nice. So that's very nice. So it brings up the standard with 4 and 5 on the same system for the most part, which is nice. But yeah. So if I wanted to play, say, Battlefield. Battlefield 1, Battlefield 5, for example, those games had Xbox One X versions that looked a lot better, but the base Xbox One versions were like, 810p, 900p. They didn't look the greatest on a 4K screen, I will say. But the games that ran at like 1080p were like fine. And I was totally fine with that, because at that point, like I said, the PS5, again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but the Series S, well, it was marketed as a 1440p machine at the time. Maybe it still is, I'm not sure. It was never really that, and I think people even at the time knew it wasn't really going to be that. It was going to be the 1080p machine. And you know what? When the Series S is the 1080p machine, I have no issues with it. My issues come from, again, those games where it goes to like 720p FSR2. But when it hits 1080p, I'm fine with it. It's the cheaper console. It's going to run games worse than the better one. Like that's just how it works. But as long as the frame rates are stable enough and the resolution is fine, I think it's totally fine. But yeah, so form factor, portability are probably the two biggest things I like about the Series S, and the fact that it just complements the PS5 so well stylistically, in my opinion. And the price. That was obviously the big thing, right? It was a, quote, next generation console for $300. Although, again, nowadays you can get it for cheaper than that. I mean, I'm not going to look it up right now, but again, you can find them for like $200, maybe even less on eBay. So it's like, you want a Game Pass machine and you're not fussed about the resolutions too much? Series S is not terrible. It's not bad. Now, I will say the 512 gig storage. That is a legit limitation. Now, I never got a memory card for the Series X or I think I'm screwing up the names here. Series X, Series S. But I never got a memory card for either console, so I'm still rocking the regular 1 terabytes on the Series X. Although on the PS5, I do have a 2 terabyte NVMe SSD. But I haven't gotten anything like that for the Series X because, again, it's a Game Pass machine, so I'm not really too fussed about it, storing a ton of games long term. But yeah, the Series S though. I've probably rambled a bit too long on this, if I'm being honest. This video probably should have been like 15 minutes shorter, if not 20. But this is me we're talking about. I'd like to ramble. It's just how these things work. But I guess let's wrap around back to the actual point of the video, which is, was the Series S a mistake? Or was it a good idea? Well, I think I understand Microsoft's philosophy with it. This was 2020. They wanted to have a console that was affordable. They wanted an entry point for Game Pass. And you know what? When they were designing this thing, it probably made sense. Long term, though, it's proven to have issues. Big issues. Especially in the case of the memory. And the thing is, it's something that they can't really fix, because I know some people talked about, put out like a Series S revision that adds like more RAM or whatever. Yeah, that doesn't fix the problem. Because there's already, 20, 30 million Series S's out there that are the 10 gigs and 500 gigs of storage and all. I mean, the 500 gigs of storage doesn't really matter because you can just get a memory card. But the RAM, you can't upgrade the RAM. You can't upgrade the graphics. They're set in stone. And well, for lack of a better term, Microsoft, they kind of made their bed, now they have to lie in it, These are the specs they chose in 2019, 2020, and now they kind of just have to run with it. And if they do lift the limitation at some point of, hey, you don't have to make a Series S version, then that's going to be controversial, because developers are going to ditch the Series S, and then the people that have a Series S, which again is most of the people that have a current gen Xbox, are going to complain about it. So that's not going to go down well. But I don't know. I don't know. That's a whole other that whole aspect of it's kind of a whole other thing. But was it a good idea? Well, again, I like the Series S overall. But was it a mistake? Was it a mistake? Just to answer that question, I'm going to say, at this stage in the game, as of May 2025, the answer is probably yes. Now, the only real exception I would have to that would be, okay, well, if the Series S didn't exist and there was only the Series X, then how much would the Series X had sold? Because, how many people that would have bought a Series X if it was the only option available, if the Series S hadn't have existed, like how many people are in that group, right? Because again, while we don't know the exact numbers, again, the majority of people that have a current gen Xbox have a Series S. How many of them would have bought a Series X otherwise if that was the only option on the table? We're not really going to know, because again, one of the big appealing points of the Series S was the price tag, and obviously the Series X would have been like $500 versus $300. So that is definitely a question I cannot answer, not even remotely. But obviously, but let's just pretend that somehow the people that the people that have a Series S now that bought it because of that price tag would not have bought a Series X if it was the only option there. And then the Series X would have only sold like 10 million units. Well, obviously, if that was the case, then that would look really bad for Microsoft. Although, again, Microsoft isn't really concerned about console sales at this point, for better or for worse. But I don't know. Even for them, 10 million that'd be the worst selling console like ever, at least of like the main consoles. Because of course, right now the worst selling console, again, of the main consoles. We're not talking about we're not talking about the Neo Geo. We're not talking about the ColecoVision. I mean, the ColecoVision was a main console in its day. But we're not talking about those. We're talking about the big, the Nintendo, the Microsoft, the Sega, the Sony. That. If we're talking about that, then the Wii U, I believe, is the worst selling console. How much did the Dreamcast sell? I don't know how much the Dreamcast sold, but the Dreamcast was only around for like 2 years, so that's kind of a hard one to really judge. But at least of like the major consoles from the last 20 years, the Wii U has been the worst performing, of course, at 13.6 million units or whatever. I really doubt that the Series X would have sold worse than that. I think the Series X would have still done 20-25 million, even if it was the only option there. But it's hard to really know, because again, the Series X being the only option really changes the whole equation with Xbox and Microsoft and how people would perceive their systems. So it's kind of hard to tell, but certainly the answer to the question, was it a mistake? If you ask developers, their answer is probably going to be a pretty unanimous yes, it was a mistake. It was a bad idea. It holds us back. We have to develop for this weaker hardware that we don't want to develop for, especially when Xbox hasn't sold particularly well this generation, and PlayStation is our main audience, and PlayStation, of course, the PS5 is much more powerful than the Series S, and that's our baseline for development. Like, that's the console we develop our games in mind for, not the Series S. Which, actually, that brings us to something I haven't quite talked too much about yet, which is the whole idea of the Series S will hold back the generation because it will be the baseline. Honestly, I'm not really sure if that panned out in the end, because that would have made sense at first, but I feel like the more the generation has gone on, and the worse performing the Series S has gotten, obviously a part of that is the technical limitations of the console with the 10 gigs of RAM and stuff. I think it's also just the fact that the Series S is not the baseline. The PS5 is the baseline, and they're taking their PS5 game and cutting it down to run on the Series S. They're not developers are not making Series S games that just look better on Series X and PS5. No, they're taking PS5 and Series X games and cutting them down, if that makes any sense. Like, for example, Prince of Persia, the Prince of Persia 2D game that came out a year or two ago. That game was developed for the Switch. It wasn't a regular game that got cut down to be ported to the Switch like most games do. No, it was a game that was designed around the Switch's hardware, and that also just happened to get versions on PlayStation and Xbox. So of course it looks and runs well on the Switch because it was designed for the Switch. Same goes for a Monster Hunter Rise. That's a game that was designed for the Switch. It got ports to other consoles later, but it was designed for the Switch, so it looks and runs fine on the Switch because it was designed for the Switch. The Series S doesn't have this because people are not developing games for the Series S. They're developing games for the PS5 and Xbox Series X, and then just cutting them down wherever they can so that they run, quote unquote, on the Series S. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, from a developer's perspective, their answer would probably be a big fat no. It was a bad idea. It should never have happened. We should have just had the Series X and PS5. But from the casual user perspective, their opinion's probably mixed. I mean, obviously the online, YouTube, Reddit, Twitter answer is going to be, it was a bad idea because of X, Y, and Z, reasons we've already talked about. But with the casual person, the person that's not into all this gaming news and discussion, the person that's just has a console that plays the games they want to play, and that's all it is to them. They're not into this, if that makes any sense. Their answer would probably be a lot more mixed. There probably would be a lot of people that say, hey, the Series, because there's probably a lot of kids out there that got a Series S as their first ever console, right? And because of that, it's going to mean a lot to them in the future, right? We all remember our first console. My first console was a GameCube, and I still have it to this day. I'll never give it up. But, there's a lot of people out there, kids especially, that probably did get a Series S as their first ever console, and the only reason they got it was because it was $300 instead of $500. So in that respect, obviously to them the Series S is a net positive, but I don't know. But again, I know I've been going in circles. Apologies, it's just what I do here. But to finally wrap this up, was the Series S a mistake? Yes and no. But if you're going to put a gun to my head and ask me to give you a real answer, then my answer is yes, it was a mistake. Not a strong mistake, but a mistake. Because the limitations of the hardware have become very much apparent as things have gone on. And also the Series S didn't really help Microsoft as much as I think they thought it would. Because again, while console hardware sales are not as important to them as it has been, they still want to sell consoles, They're not making this thing for nothing, They're not just spending hundreds of dollars in manufacturing for these consoles to sit on shelves. They want people to buy them. So the fact that the Series X and S combined is only 25-30 million 4 years in, when the PS5 is 70 million, yeah, that's not a great look, even if that's not something they really care about anymore. So the whole argument of, they want the Series S because they want to have a mass adoption option for, tens of millions of people to get an Xbox in their rooms. Now, if the console had sold better, then I think that would have been considered a success for them. But it hasn't. Now, I don't know how well it's doing compared to the Xbox One. But whether it's lower or higher, the fact that it's in that range at all is not great for them, I will say. Now, the Xbox One, for as much as people love to crap on the Xbox One, the Xbox One did actually all right in the end. Now, by the end of the generation in 2021, they finally killed it off. Literally, they stopped manufacturing it in 2020. Actually, before the Series X and PS5 even came out, they were already discontinuing it, or stopped manufacturing it, rather. The Xbox One, well, again, we don't have any official numbers from Microsoft. The rumored number is around 50-something million. And you know what? For a console that started out as infamously as the Xbox One did with, Don Matrick and the TV, and all that stuff everyone's memed and talked about to death a million times over. For all of that, for as infamously as the Xbox One started off, Phil Spencer, say what you will about him, and obviously a lot of people have very strong opinions on him these days with, again, the push for Game Pass and the moving away from the console actually mattering with multi-platform, which again is a whole other video in and of itself that maybe we'll talk about, maybe we won't, I don't know, we'll see. But he managed to ride the ship of the Xbox One in terms of hardware sales. Obviously the PS4 sold twice as much. The PS4 is at like 100, 110 million, I forget the exact number. But 50 million, when it was all said and done, that's still double the amount of the original Xbox. That's something, That's not a bad number. It's not a great number. But it's an okay number, all things considered. So, when because people like to say the Xbox One was a failure. I mean, compared to the PS4, sure. But I don't know if I would go as far as to call it a failure. It just underperformed compared to what it could have been. Because the 360 was a juggernaut, right, in its generation, especially in those early years. And by the end of the generation, both the 360 and PS3 were at about the same number, about 85 million. Which you combine that with the Wii's 100 million. That was the only time, at least in modern console history that I know of, where all three of the console manufacturers were at pretty much the same number. Right? Because, the PS1 was like 100-something million, the N64 was like 35 million, I forget, or 40 million, whatever the number was. It wasn't that many. And then, of course, the GameCube sold even less. It was like 25 million. And then the PS2, of course, was a juggernaut, 150, 160 million. Original Xbox, 25 million. But then, of course, PS3 was about 80, 90. 360 was 80, 90. And then the Wii was like 100-something. So all three of the consoles did really well that generation. And then, of course, the generation after that, Xbox One, 50-something million. PS4, 110 million. Wii U, 13.6 million. But then, of course, the Switch came out in the middle of the generation and is now currently on track to being the next best-selling console, although we'll see if it actually hits it. I'm not sure if it'll beat the PS2, but it will definitely beat the DS. The DS it'll definitely beat by the end of the year, I think, but that's a whole other thing. But, yeah. Console sales. So, yeah, the Series S didn't really help them in the console sales department all that much. And again, with their shift to multi-platform, I still have my Series X. I'm going to hold on to it for the rest of the generation. I do like the Series X. It's a good piece of hardware. Again, it's a Game Pass machine. I play, Forza, Halo, stuff like that on it. That's cool and all. I'm not going to get rid of it anytime soon. I was debating getting rid of it. I'm just moving to PC for all my Xbox stuff, because, of course, everything's on PC. But, I don't know. I like the convenience of a console. And my PC, which is theoretically more powerful than it, it's got a 6900 XT. Well, it's theoretically more powerful than it. It doesn't run most of the games better than the Series X by enough to justify playing it on PC. For me, at least right now. So I mainly use my PC hardware for like emulators and video rendering and streaming and stuff like that. I actually haven't played that many PC games on my PC in a little while, actually, to be honest. But that's a whole other thing. Yeah, I'm going to hold on to my Series X for the rest of the generation, but next generation, in a couple years, in 2027, 2028, when the PS6 and the next Xbox come out, and there will be a new Xbox. We know there's going to be a new Xbox. They've reaffirmed that a couple of times now. Will I get it? I'm not really sure, to be honest. Because by that point, Halo's going to be on PlayStation. I mean, we got Forza on PlayStation. The new Gears of War remaster's coming out on PlayStation. It's only a matter of time until the Chief lands on PlayStation. Whether it's with MCC or Infinite or the new game that's supposed to be Unreal Engine 5. Again, Microsoft, this is not subtle in the slightest. They have made it very, 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 very clear. Multi-platform is their future. That is what they're doing. They're done with console exclusives, which again is a whole other video in and of itself that maybe we'll do another time. But because of the fact that I can play those games on PlayStation, I mean, I'm not going to re-buy Forza Horizon 5 for full price right now, because why bother when I have it on Xbox? But when Forza Horizon 6 comes out, maybe I'll get that on PlayStation. Who knows? When next Halo comes out, maybe I'll just get that on PlayStation. No, we'll see. We'll see what happens. We're just gonna have to see what happens with the PS6 and next Xbox and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, look, I don't engage in console war nonsense. I've always thought that's kind of stupid. You know, I have a PlayStation, I have an Xbox, I have a Nintendo system. I like all of them. They all have their pros. They all have their consoles. You know, I don't engage in any of that console war stuff. You know, I have all of them. I like all of them. They all have their pros. They all have their cons. But even still, I think it's definitely hard to look at Xbox and not say that their future, at least in the hardware business, is not looking great. And again, everyone's got their opinion on whether or not them going multi-platform is a good or a bad thing. I would say for the future of Xbox hardware, it's a bad thing, but for the future of their software, it might be a good thing. But again, that's a whole other video for another time. You know, the state of exclusivity on consoles and whether or not it's a good thing or not. That really could be a whole discussion in and of itself for all of the big three, for that matter. But again, that is a story for another time. So, yeah, I think we're about done here. This video's been going on for about an hour. These discussions need to get shorter, man, but I can't help it. I just like to ramble and go in circles. It's just what I do. It's one of the reasons why I think making a regular video has been so difficult for me, because it's like trying to make like a tight script is so hard when it's so easy to want to just go off into tangents and talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. But yeah. But yeah, so I guess what do you guys think? Do you guys have a Series S? Have you ever tried a Series S? Did you ever have one? Did you ever had any interest in one? You know, what do you guys think about it? Do you think the Series S was a good idea or not? Do you like the Series S? Do you hate the Series S? Are you indifferent to it? You know, whatever you got to say about the Series S and really just kind of the state of Microsoft, by all means, let me know down below. And I guess, well, with that being said, this is Logan59XP, and I'll see you guys next time.